all these fancy gadgets in front of me, I have no space in which to put my gadget from which I should speak.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is, I guess, the end of year. We will call it the end of year press conference that the minister is hosting. And in asking your questions, I would like to ask you to identify yourself and your news agency. The minister may know you, but while I know some of you, especially the old heads, I don't know everybody. So please identify yourselves as you ask your questions. We will go right into the press conference, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Let me first of all take the opportunity to introduce to you formally Ms. Sharon McPherson, who is working out of the Office of the Minister, responsibility for public diplomacy and PR matters. This is part of that exercise. I'd like also to take the opportunity to say a few words to you before you put your questions. I hope you'll find that agreeable. Some of the staff of the ministry are at hand in case I need rescuing, and when the time arises, I will identify them if necessary. I see, so some of them you would know. I see at the back Neville Toteram and Michael Brotherson. I'm sure these are amongst those you perhaps know best. But let me not attempt to give you a listing. I just wanted to say to you that as the year comes to a close, I thought it would be useful to say a few words about the work of the ministry, what has been done, undertaken during the course of the year, and perhaps to suggest a few directions that we'll be taking in the course of 2017. It's useful, I think, to say a few words on this front because I think it is often forgotten exactly what the ministry has responsibility for. When you hear different segments of the press, of the Guyanese elements speak, you get the impression that the work of the ministry is either a very limited and narrow area or something very nebulous. First and foremost, just to remind you, we are the main interface between the people of Guyana and the international community, and more importantly, between the government of Guyana and its bilateral and multilateral partners elsewhere. That means that amongst the things that we are required to do, if I might just call them randomly, you are, of course, familiar with the international diplomacy aspects. We speak to ambassadors, we speak to the representatives at the UN and so forth. But you also have, we also have the responsibility, of course, of advising the government on that interface with the international community, on diplomatic and international economic matters. So that is one of the sets of tasks we have, and within the ministry, there are officers assigned to undertake such work. So that needs to be remembered, and I'm mentioning this so that you will know, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that the Arthur Chung International Center is about to start undergo a process of rehabilitation. That is a reflection of the work that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs undertakes as part of its interface with the government of China in the course of developing our cooperation arrangements with the government of China. You have work on, for example, the agreement, the framework agreement on the concessional loan for the East Bank and East Coast Demerara Road, the road widening projects. That's part of the work that the ministry does. It doesn't necessarily do it alone, but it acts as the main interface. And in some of these, for example, in working with the new ferry project, 80 million US ferry project. With the Chinese, we work in conjunction with the Ministry of Finance, for example. But responsibility for communicating government's decision and for accepting recommendations or coordinating work, coordinating the collaboration, that's the responsibility of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Those aspects you may be more familiar with, but I think often not being aware of the specific projects. You would have seen, for example, that we signed an agreement, 24 million, with the European Union in November, arising from the funds that had been committed for support to the sugar sector. And this was something that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would have been working with the Europeans on in the framework of Lomé and the Cotonou Agreement. In addition to that type of work, which is the more traditional work that we undertake, you have the work of the consulates. So you have a consul general in New York, you have one in Paramaribo, you had one in Barbados. You have one in Barbados. When I say had, that was the post of Mr. Brotherson, for example, in Barbados. And their responsibility is primarily to look after the Guyanese citizens who are in those countries and foreign citizens who have an interest, for example, in getting information on Guyana, traveling to Guyana, those Guyanese who in these countries land themselves in hot water, so they may find themselves in prison, in the hands of the police, unable to pay bills for hospitals, without visas, in need of visas, passports need renewing. Those are also some of the functions that we carry out, which I think are often forgotten. We also have responsibilities along those lines in relation to the diaspora. And I see a note from one of the officers saying that the ministry has received, its budget is 5.1 billion for 2017, and it's been suggested in some set of comments somewhere that that is for working with the diaspora. It is a budget, current and capital, for all the work of the ministry. Just giving you an idea. Yes, we do work with the diaspora. We have a diaspora strategy program, meaning that we asked one of the international agencies which offered us a grant to help us fashion a diaspora engagement strategy, the strategy that will enable us to interface more effectively with the diaspora, to find out what their needs are, how we can best communicate with them, what are the best devices, what are the topics, how we can build upon whatever institutions they already have in place. Now, if you read the newspapers, you will get the impression that we have dissed the diaspora. You know, we are promised a whole set of things. We are doing absolutely nothing. All sorts of outrageous statements are being made. Let me start by saying, whilst the Ministry of Foreign Affairs may itself be regarded by you as the only agency responsible for engaging the diaspora and for managing the interface with the diaspora, you have at least a dozen other ministries that regard themselves as having a primary responsibility for the Guyana diaspora interface. That aspect has to be settled. The ministries have to persuade the cabinet of their role in that diaspora strategy, how they can be most effective, and then the cabinet has to decide on a division of labor. That has not yet been done. So all the abusing out that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs receives from those ill-informed persons, however well-intentioned, is just that, ill-informed. We are not ignoring the diaspora. We are not treating them as not important. We recognize, as I've often said, that the diaspora has a lot of contributions to make in terms of its skills, its knowledge, but we are not, as Ministry of Foreign Affairs, mandated to be a recruitment agency for the people of the diaspora of New York, for example, which is where a lot of the complaints and things are rising. People can come and they can run ministries and they can run businesses, they can take on GPL and so forth, and the Foreign Affairs has failed to take advantage of those skills. This is not the job of Foreign Affairs. We are not an employment exchange. If any agency exists with that capacity or with that mandate, it would be Minister Lawrence's agency, Minister Scott's. And in fact, their capacity, even in general employment employment exchange function, would be quite limited. So that is an aspect. It may have taken longer than one should have taken, but that is a process we're still distilling thoughts on. And I just wanted it to be clear. It's not a failure to carry out responsibilities and not forgetting our obligations. There are also, of course, protocol issues that we carry out functions when CARICOM has meetings here, when there are international conventions. Whether or not these functions are directly Foreign Affairs alone, we have a responsibility. Whenever there's an event involving diplomats, even if it is Ministry of Education or Ministry of Infrastructure, our task is to ensure that the diplomats are properly handled. They are given the requisite levels of protocol. That means a degree of competence, understanding of precedents and what went on before, international practice, all of that needs to be known. And I'll come back in a minute to explain why it's important that we all understand the functions in the ministry. But for the moment, let me say to you that also amongst those functions is the issue of CARICOM skill certificates. You will know that the region has agreed to create a single economic space. Within that economic space, goods move. They don't move perfectly, but they move. Within that economic space, people are supposed to move, and they're supposed to move within parameters that have been set by the governments, and they should be able to move reasonably freely. In fact, it doesn't happen. But insofar as they move, those who can move, once they have a skill certificate, they can move reasonably freely amongst the states. Ministry of Foreign Affairs is charged with that responsibility, not with giving out the certificates at the whims and fancy of the minister, but on the basis of criteria that all the countries have agreed to. So I can't sign a certificate, and I'm looking at you journalists in the eye, that I can just issue to you because you are either just bright or you're working or you smile very nicely. The criteria that we all would have had to agree, and the same criteria that I use to inform the certificates I sign, the Minister of Foreign Affairs uses to issue certificates in Barbados to Barbadians who may be interested in coming to Guyana. So I hope from that very cursory list of things that we do, you have an idea of the tasks with which we are charged. In the course of 2017, some of the things that we'll be paying special attention to would include trade agreements. We have a section. You will know that Ms. Gail Teixeira had raised questions about this year and last year as regards the amounts made available, the number of persons employed to undertake such work. And all I want to say to you here is that, especially in the light of the recent initiatives in terms of creating trade blocs in the Pacific, for example, the controversy taking place over the trade bloc involving the European Union, and the impact of new policies by the President-designate of the United States, you can expect trade, international trade, regional trade agreements to be the focus of some of the international economic diplomacy during the course of the year and 2017. And we have, of course, a section which is responsible for this. We are trying to build up that section, and as part of that undertaking, you will know that we have agreed to establish an office in Geneva, because Geneva, let me just say, Geneva actually is the city, other than New York, which has the largest number of international bodies having their headquarters there. So the first thing, that is a very important location. In addition to that, it has the WTO. The WTO is the major international institution that has responsibility for defining and enforcing rules on trade. So if countries put up illegal trade barriers or they're seeking to deepen trade relations amongst themselves, that initiative has to be consistent with the rules as agreed in the WTO. We are a member of the WTO. CARICOM is, as a group, also in the WTO. And in order to be sure that you're living within the rules that you've agreed, you need staff that have the competence to understand the rules, which have become increasingly complicated, and rules which increasingly, for that reason, require inputs not merely of economists, which was the international trade was at one stage almost the sole purview of economists who would have done international trade, international monetary economics, and so forth. Today, you will find a large number of lawyers amongst any group doing international trade, simply because there are so many agreements, there's so many principles now enshrined in those trading agreements. We also, therefore, have to ensure that our team is properly constituted. And in addition to being constituted, it has to be properly located. We were the representatives of the region at one point in relation to the WTO trade matters, international trade matters, but we had no officer in Geneva where the discussion was taking place. Without an officer there, you have to be sending one from Brussels or one from Georgetown. It's very expensive, and they never learn the system as well as they should. So we have decided to assign officers there in an embassy. You already have an ambassador there. This is Ambassador Dr. Deep Ford, with extensive international experience, particularly in the area of agriculture, agricultural trade, and one of our officers from Washington has been assigned there to look at political matters, because although I've made great play of the trade dimension, it is, Geneva is the capital of a country, Switzerland. We have bilateral relations with Switzerland, and therefore a political officer has to be assigned there. In normal circumstances, the bilateral headquarters, or the headquarters for the bilaterals, is not, it's not Geneva itself. But what we're going to do is to combine. We have one office to do bilaterals with Switzerland and other places, and also the WTO matters and some of the international institutions that are there. Okay? So that office, to which we've assigned officers, and we're, as trade specialists, will also be going shortly, will be responsible for dealing with that aspect of our work. I see this young lady on my right smiling rather serenely, suggesting on my right, suggesting that perhaps I'm talking too long. So I will say a couple more words and stop there. This is just to give you an idea of what it is we have been doing. We've been working with our bilateral and regional partners in Latin America. You will know the Caribbean side, in terms of facilitating travel within the region, and that is very, very important if you're going to enhance trade and more importantly, investment, which is something that we are seeking. And so you've had visa arrangements, visa waiver arrangements for persons traveling. I know, and I've seen in in the some of the comments that, you know, why do you want to bother with visa facilitation arrangements with this or that Latin American country? I don't want to go there. My friends don't want to go there. That may well be true, and I acknowledge that, but it isn't germane. Our responsibility is to facilitate the development of Guyana. The development of Guyana will turn upon Guyana being part of an economic and political animal that is larger than 700,000 people. You are a speck. You know what plankton is? Do you know what plankton is? Plankton are the minuscule occupants of the ocean that whales feed on. And I once worked with an ambassador who described those of us that she didn't think much of because we were small and unimportant as plankton. In a sense, Guyana is plankton in the ocean. We are so small that if we attempt to survive merely on the basis of our numbers, we are not going to get very far, however bright we think we are as a people. So we have somehow to transform ourselves from a tiny state, even land size wise. We are very small, very small. We need to be larger. And part of that process of enlarging ourselves has to do with economic integration. We have at one stage done it in relation to CARICOM. That is a process that has not gone as far as we'd like to. Guyana wants to be at the center of that enlargement. Part of that enlargement has also to do with trying to ensure that we cooperate and integrate with Latin America as a whole, South America, Latin America, and Central America. That's part of our thrust. And in that sense, we've been trying to ensure that these types of arrangements, visas and others, enable potential investors from these countries, those entrepreneurs and businessmen with experience and skills in the technological frontiers, to look at Guyana by seeing it not only on the TV, but being able to visit where necessary and making an assessment about our capacity to receive investors and their resources, and to ensure that they get a fair return to their investment, even as they undertake work in areas that are critical to our future development, technological development in areas such as telecommunications. It's key. No development of tourism, agro-processing, modern mining will take place if we are unable to put down the infrastructure associated with these areas. And that is part and parcel of the process of deepening relations with Latin Americans. Yes, I know people say, well, we don't speak Spanish, so what is the point? Other people have to speak Spanish. Your representatives within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have to develop a range of skills. That's why I was saying to you what it is we're doing. They have to be able to understand documents. They have to be lawyers, okay, chemists. They have to develop a range of skills within the ambit of the institution that is this Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay? And so sometimes you will see us doing things you don't understand. Feel free to ask. Feel free to ask. Don't just dismiss it as being the idiosyncrasies of the minister or the ignorance or prejudices of APNU and others. These are issues that are central to our very future existence. All right? I hope that isn't. I hope that is not what I'm trying to say is not unclear. Just to give you a feel of some of the things. We are, of course, amongst the priorities we have, are priorities to do with the maintenance of our sovereignty. And I'm not going to say any more on that because I know you probably will have questions on that front. But the intention is to just give you a feel for that. And perhaps finally to say to you, as regards some of the headlines I've seen arising out of the debate on the foreign affairs budget, I believe that the questions that were asked, for example, in relation to expenditure on ambassadors, may not have been fully understood by those who crafted the headlines. In essence, in 2015, we undertook to try and rebuild and to establish a Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a capacity to deal with some of these challenges that I've made. And we have, in the course of 2016, recruited a number of ambassadors, many of whom are outstanding in a number of ways. Outstanding as physicists, extensive experience in business, for example, distinguished linguists, all of these are amongst them. So, the 2017 budget, in respect of the funding for ambassadors, for example, and embassies, would be more than 2016, because for most of 2016, the posts weren't filled. So now, these persons are in place, and therefore, that would account for why you have increases in emoluments in particular, not because they've been paid more than they were paid before. You didn't have an embassy in Switzerland, you didn't have one in Trinidad and Tobago, where an ambassador will be responsible, or high commissioner will be responsible for all the Eastern Caribbean states. In the past, we didn't have anyone charged with that who is out there. It was done from here. So now from Port of Spain and from Barbados, we can cover the Eastern Caribbean states and get more quickly to countries as the need for visits arises, and have someone out there who is in the middle of the action and can get a feel for what needs are and can be working on a day-to-day basis with our counterparts in the Caribbean. Of course, it's a very important space for Guyana. So just to give you an idea of what is taking place and what may lie behind some of the things, some of the headlines, some of the questions that may have been asked. And I want to say perhaps that in the discussions and the debates that have taken place, notwithstanding some of those funny headlines arising from the queries, that you will notice that the opposition has, in its own interventions, called for more skills in a number of the areas of foreign affairs. Just to remind you of that. Okay, more skills, especially in the area of trade, Mr. Shearer, for example, raised. And also, I'm happy to indicate to you that we've had full cooperation from the opposition party in relation to our handling and approach to the question of Guyana's sovereignty, especially as it pertains to the matters sent to the UNSG, and in which he gave us a response a little over a week ago. Okay, so thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to receive any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Please remember to identify your agency and give your name. Yes, there's.
What investment has it had, you want? Do you have an index? You want me to say 70%, 12%? We have had, I think, a reasonable degree of success in our work in this sense. Thank you. A reasonable degree of success in these efforts, in the sense that we have, perhaps the easiest way for you to measure whether we are successful is, first of all, to look at the efforts that are made, and you can get that from an indication of, for example, the acceptance of credentials of ambassadors, new countries that are approaching us, and also inquiries and cooperation between the sector ministries and some